Good evening if you're in Hong Kong, and good afternoon if you're in the UK. Today we got Joanna and Lisa again. We really appreciate that they come to Leo Education again to do the webinar with us, because we are going to talk about different types of different topics of SEN every time. And today our topic is dyslexia. Is that right, Joanna? Lisa, hello again.
Right. Hi, Leo.
Hi.
Not too bad. I'll leave it to you, and then you can give us some more insights about SEN.
Perfect. So welcome everybody to our webinar on how to support your dyslexic child with reading, spelling, and writing. It's a great privilege again to be here. I think this is the third in our series, Leo. Yes, to be together again to talk about all things to do with special educational needs. Hopefully there are some families who've been able to attend the previous ones as well. So you'll be able to have received information from before. But today we are going to focus on reading, writing, and spelling, thinking about the dyslexic profile. So just a quick introduction for those who we've not met before. My name is Lisa Low, and this is Joanna. She'll introduce herself in a second. And Joanna and I are part of Beyond Bridges Education, BBE. And we're based here in the UK, but we work internationally as well as in the UK, supporting families with children who have learning differences. And we support them in their educational journeys here in the UK, but actually we've been asked to support families internationally as well. And we offer a whole range of services. My background is as an educator for the last 30 years. I've also been a head teacher. I've been a SENCO in many different schools. I've worked internationally, private. So I've got a whole range of background in education, as well as research and academia. And right now, I suppose my main role really is to support families through educational assessment, and then providing programs and interventions, and really connecting with schools so that children are able to thrive in their schools. Joanna?
And yeah, good evening. My name's Joanna, and my background is very much on the admissions side. So I was director of admissions at a large international school. And here in the UK, we work with families as they try to join different types of UK schools, both state sector and the private sector. And we help those families through selecting those schools, finding the most appropriate school with the best level of support for their child, maybe looking a bit broader at the option of school that families might want to look at, rather than maybe just the big brand names that everybody knows. And then looking at supporting children in preparing for assessments and talking to schools about students who maybe have an educational assessment report. So it's great to join you and to talk about, as Leo said, one of the most commonly discussed areas of learning need, which is dyslexia.
Good. Okay, next slide. So today, what we're hoping to cover is to probably maximum 45 minutes, just sharing the PowerPoint presentation with you. And then we'd like to open up for discussion. Joanna is monitoring the chat, and in previous webinars, it's been really useful to have your questions coming in to be able to discuss those at the end. So please do write questions as we go along. But so today we're going to cover just a brief overview. What is dyslexia? And mostly the up-to-date information that we have today that we're using in the UK, but what we know about it. How do you know if your child has dyslexia, and what are some of the signs that you might look for? How to support your child. So again, it's a very short webinar, so we're just going to give you little tidbits of ideas of how you might think about going about supporting your child in reading, writing, and spelling. And then Joanna will talk a little bit more about how to approach the admissions process in the UK for UK school applications for those who are interested in educating their child in the UK. Some of it might be a little interactive, so you don't have to put your cameras on or anything, but I'm going to do a little bit about some of the phonic sounds. So we'll get to that in a second. So first of all, what is dyslexia? Well, just as Leo and Joanna have reiterated, it is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders. Joanna and I, through Beyond Bridges, we tend to avoid the word disorder and we prefer the word difference, because really dyslexia is it's about how a person processes information that might differ from the general population. It's highly heritable. That means that if there's a genetic if there's a father or a mother, for example, who has dyslexia, it's about 50% likely that a child, particularly a male child, will also have dyslexia. So it is very genetic, it's very highly heritable. Now, most of the time, most of the families that we work with, parents will not have had that understanding themselves. And because also 20 years ago, it may not have been as common to have diagnosis, but usually the questions that I would be asking families are, oh, you okay, Joanna? We've lost it there.
Sorry,
there we go.
I'm just looking at the chat.
Okay, so usually the families that we work with, just even questions like, do you remember how you learned to read at school? Was reading very difficult? Was an effortful process for you? And oftentimes there'll be one parent that might say, actually, yes, I found it really difficult learning to read or to write or to spell. And sometimes that's enough information for us. We used to think about dyslexia, part of the diagnosis, we used to think about the gap between a child's underlying ability and their achievement levels in reading, writing. We don't tend to use that as diagnostic criteria. However, what we can say is that usually it's unexpected. That means our dyslexic children are usually, they're very verbal, they're very bright, they're good at problem solving, but for some reason, their reading is very effortful and very slow. And those are often the markers of the dyslexic learning profile. What we have found out through research is that there are key features across all languages that have to do with the acquisition of reading and writing fluency. So really, it's about slow reading and slow writing. And even in other languages where the language is different in terms of how languages are constructed, you may still see that a child who's slow at reading, that's one of the sort of prime markers of dyslexia. So yes, difficulties in reading fluency is one of the markers that, and that just is across all, it's universal, it's across all languages. Oftentimes dyslexia is co-occurring. That means it has overlapping symptoms with other neurodevelopmental differences. So ADHD and dyslexia, autism, dyslexia, etc. So oftentimes there are one or more co-occurring conditions alongside with dyslexia. And many people have probably heard now about working memories, especially if you're if you know your schools and your teachers have been trained in this particular area. But things about working memory, that's really just about your capacity to hold on to information in a brief time, but to do something with that information. So it differs a little bit from a short-term memory. This is actually about holding on to the information, but you may have to process instructions alongside that. So you might have to do something alongside it, such as multiplication. You've got to hold on to the numbers that you times together, but then you also have to do something more with it. And that's that ability to hold on to information in working memory. So working memory, processing speed, all of these things can impact dyslexia, but they also are common for other neurodevelopmental difficulties. Okay, next slide. Okay, so some of our key indicators, if you're thinking about whether or not your child is a dyslexic learner, you would think about the family risk. So that means, was there a family member who found it difficult to read or write or spell? Did they have difficulties with any of those keystone academic areas, even mathematics, in primary school in particular? Those are one of those really strong indicators for us. Again, you're going to look for whether there's sort of persistent or unexpected difficulties. It just doesn't make sense to you. Your child is very verbal, they're very articulate, they have good ideas, they're creative. So why is it that their scores and their attainment levels in school, particularly in these key areas, are very low? And again, that there's a strong likelihood that there's a combination of cognitive challenges such as working memory or slow processing, difficulties with phonological or orthological skills. And those are all things that impact on how that dyslexia plays out in terms of its severity. Okay, next slide. So what we do know that works with dyslexic learners is that it's really important to provide targeted intervention, monitoring, and resources. So in the UK, there's been quite a lot of investment in schools to provide training for all teachers on how to support dyslexic learners. So we call it to create dyslexia-friendly schools. Now, that really depends on the borough or the schools that you're in, whether or not that school has taken that initiative forward. But there's quite a lot of knowledge within the school systems. And as I recall in Hong Kong, when I was working there as well, there's quite a lot of knowledge about dyslexia. But the point about it is that we really need to be sure that, especially for the reading and writing process in early primary, that it is targeted, that the child is receiving intervention, particularly at that early intervention stage. Some of the protective factors, that means the factors that can support whether or not if the impact of the dyslexia on your child's learning, is that there's early intervention and that it's sustained over time. So dyslexia in the earlier years for a child may manifest or look like difficulties in actual beginning the process of reading, but in secondary school, it could look like the organization and planning that's needed for different subjects, like writing essays, for example, or the time that they need, the extra time that they need sitting in exams. So dyslexia is a lifelong condition. So it's important to be able to have some focus and attention around how to support your child right the way through their educational journey. Good oral language and verbal and nonverbal skills, these are also great protective factors. So even if your child is struggling in their reading, for example, it's really important that they're getting enough engagement orally in terms of being able to be inspired through literacy and literature in your home environment as well as in school. There are many things that we'll come to in a minute that can be put into place to help support that reading process, or a child who might have lower reading ability. But if we think about the typical profile of a dyslexic learner, it's an unexpected profile. They usually have high interest areas, but they may have low reading attainment. So we want to make sure that we are always plugging them and filling them with this lots of lovely oral language. And one thing that I always used to say to the teachers who I worked with and to parents is that we want our children to develop enough vocabulary and special vocabulary, ambitious vocabulary and words that we just allow to roll off their tongue. It doesn't mean that they have to read or write them, but it's important for them to be able to absorb all this good language. So keep those conversations going. And most importantly, for dyslexic learners, if you have seen that there is a consistent lack of progress in reading or writing, despite the intervention that, say, schools putting in place, then it probably is important to get a special assessor to have a look and to think about what are the specific areas of difficulty, because we just don't want that reading progress to lag behind too far from their peers, as it's one of our kind of main key academic skills that we want to be able to support our children with. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we're thinking now around the things that can support our dyslexic learners. Now in the UK, and I know as well as in Hong Kong, we follow the phonic approach. In years gone by, reading approaches looked somewhat different. And in my day, for example, it was the whole word approach. So we were just learning almost by rote what the whole word was. And you're either lucky to have a memory to be able to do that, or maybe not so lucky because you weren't able to hold on to those whole words. But as we know in the UK and again in Hong Kong, is we're following a phonic program, and our programs that we follow are called the synthetic phonic approach. The reason that we are using this is because when it comes down to reading, what we really want, and particularly for our dyslexic learners, is to be able to hear those very individual smallest units of sounds within words, because that's what dyslexic learners tend to have the most difficulty. If I give you an example, if I were to say to a dyslexic learner, I would like you to repeat after me, say the word stop. The child would say stop. And I would say, now say stop without the s sound. And the word would be top. To be able to delete individual sounds in words or to put individual sounds back into words, that's a very tricky skill for our dyslexic learners. They just cannot process those individual sounds. So this is why this program is very important for them. It doesn't mean that it's going to work for every child, which is why I always advocate having other strategies. But I just thought that we would have a little taster about how this works. So the phonemes here, where it says the simple speed sounds, these are what we call our phonemes. They're the single sounds that we can hear, the smallest units of sounds. So in schools, what we do with our learners is we would do something what we call my turn, your turn, and we would review the sounds, trying to do them quite speedily so that it becomes a very automatic process for the children. So I'll have a go of the first line doing the sounds, but please feel free at home to make the sound after you hear me, just so you can get an idea. So the first one would be o, s, z, sh, ink, and so on. So the children learn their very initial sounds to begin with, and then they move on to what we call our digraphs, our two sounds that walk together, but usually the vowel digraphs, the first sound does the talking. So if I go down to the third row and we look at where two letters, we call them two letters and they're special friends, they make one sound. So two letters, one sound. So if I look at AY, that is A, E, I, O, and so on. So children begin to learn those sounds, and they're the first set of sounds that the children learn. Now, these 44 sounds make up the English language, and this is what's taught to our children. For our dyslexic children, it's really important that they get a lot of rehearsal being able to recognize these sounds, because what happens is the English language clearly becomes more complex. And if we look at the complex speed sound chart over here, you can see that those initial phonemes, for example, has two other ways that letters combine to make that phoneme. So if we look at the first one, we've got a single, then we've got words like cliff, so we've got double, and then we've got the sound also made by what we call a grapheme, the combination of letters making one sound, which is PH, as in photo. So it becomes very, very complex, particularly for our dyslexic learners, to be able to realize that that one sound can be represented in many different ways. So we have to be very mindful about how we introduce our sounds to our children, particularly our dyslexic children. Okay, next slide. I hope people were able to practice some of that at home. So once our children begin to learn the most initial sounds, we want to get them reading as quickly as possible, and we do that through blending. So decoding is just another word that means effectively to decode the letters in front of them and make associations between that letter and those sounds. So we start with the most basic words like sat. So S-A-T, sat, sat, is part of the first set of sounds that the children will meet. So we want to get them blending pretty quickly to help them to feel like they're readers. As soon as they're able to identify these sounds and match them to the letters, they've become readers. So we try to do that and boost their confidence as much as possible. So the blending process then, if we look down here at the example with fish, this comes from a program called Read, Write, Ink through the Oxford University Press. There's many different synthetic programs, phonic programs that are used in the UK. This is one that I'm very familiar with and have had great success with as well. So the first word, if we look at fish, we think, can the child read this word? No, they cannot. So then we're going to start looking at sounds. Okay, so fish is made up of 3 sounds. Ish, fish. From that identification of understanding that there are 3 individual units of sound, ish, we then be able to blend the sounds together to make the word fish. So that's the most basic introduction to reading, and that's the program that your children would be receiving when they come into the UK. What I found when I've worked with families who've come from, for example, from China or Hong Kong, is that sometimes the children haven't come with the same level of phonic instruction. So it means that they're sort of diving in to their school systems here, and they perhaps haven't got the most fundamental parts of the phonic instruction. So I think it's really important to make sure that they got enough of the solid background before they come in into the school system here. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so not all words, however, in the English language make sense to us and follow the rules. And this is what we call our irregular words or high frequency words. People interchange those two. High frequency just simply means these are the words that are most often seen in a piece of text. Oh, sorry, back one. They're irregular because they don't quite follow the rules yet. So if we have a look at, in this program, Read, Write, Ink, they're called red words, just to be able to signal that they're not sort of the rule followers just yet. But if we were to look at the word of, for example, the children will have learned that those 2 phonemes are of. But of course, when we put it together for this irregular word of, that doesn't make sense. So we teach these words as irregular words or red words, or words that are for a little while don't follow the rules. And we really have to teach these words by memory because the sounds don't match their letters yet. So we do have to teach these words by memory, and there's plenty of games that you can do so that you do learn the whole words, such as the lotto or the bingo, or what have you. So that's pretty common in most reading and spelling programs today. Next slide. Okay, so things that you can do at home. So this is particularly for the early primary stages. But just like I said at the very first slide with dyslexia, we want to give them as much of a literacy environment as possible. So we want children to be playing with sounds and words. We want them to spot sounds in their environments. These things are all very, very important for children, particularly the dyslexic children, because they have a much harder time hearing all these individual units of sounds. So things like I spy with my little eye, something that begins with sh. Rhyme is really important. So being able to identify those rhymes. So I spy with my little eye, something that rhymes with car, star, far. That's a really important literacy skill, particularly when it comes to reading texts, where you can predict based on the rhyme family that you've identified. Being able to hear chunks of words, chunks of sounds and words. So lots of games that you can play around that. So if we think about the word computer, computer, that's a 3-syllable word. There are 3 chunks. So I spy with my little eye a word that has 3 syllables. Computer, refrigerator. Oh, can't be that one. That's helping our dyslexic learners to hear that there are much smaller units of sounds within these words. Robot talk games are great. Come and sit at the table. So the children then have to put the units of sound together to make the word. What if games? What if I said the word toothbrush without the word tooth? What do I have left? Ah, brush. You're segmenting words. So again, we're doing lots of play of putting together chunks of words, taking apart words. asking your child to read along with you. We're going to talk about in a second about shared reading, and able to predict the word that's coming. One thing that our dyslexic learners are really good about, they're very good about comprehension and making sense of passages, even when they may not be decoding them perfectly accurately, because they've got this great general knowledge. So having them to be able to predict what the word that's coming, even if it's not decodable for them yet, is a really good skill. Tapping syllables, and of course, word bingos, any games where you can be able to get your child to playfully engage with decoding or putting sounds together to make words. I've put some alien words on here, if you can look at the little alien pictures. Stroft, turg, lurst. We use these a lot in our schools. They're called non-words or alien words. And really, it's just units of sounds coming together. So words made up of different phonemes and graphemes. And that's a really tricky thing often for dyslexic learners to do, because they're not able to associate a real word to a word that they may have stored in their lexicon, in their vocabulary knowledge. They may have stored real words, but these words don't allow them to access that part of their brain to be able to guess the word, so to speak, or to predict the word, because they're unknown to us. So those are really great to play with as well. Next slide. Okay, so oftentimes you'll hear dyslexic learners talk about some common text distortions. So I remember really clearly one of my assessments, and I asked the child about her reading behaviors, and I just said, can you just describe to me a little bit about what's happening on the page with those letters and words? And she said, oh, well, they sort of jump around a little bit, or sometimes I'm on one line of reading and then suddenly I miss a line and I'm on the next line of reading, or little bite-sized words such as not is missing from the word, which kind of changes the meaning of the whole text for some learners. And then I said to the child, I said, okay. And she said, well, doesn't that happen to everybody? And I remember thinking, that's amazing, because that was her assumption, is that that's just what words did when you saw them on the print. But we know that's not what happens. But sometimes some associations have been made for dyslexic learners where there are these common text distortions. So if you're finding out from your child whether or not there's dyslexia in a dyslexic learning profile, it just might be worth asking about them. Tell me about the words on the page. What's happening with those words? And just see what your child has to say about them. Okay, next slide. But of course, the most important part of the reading process is the comprehension. So the first step is for our children to be able to decode the print that's on the paper, to be able to match those sounds to letters, to be able to put words together, and to create meaning. So that's the most important thing out of all of this. And if you look at the box on the right, the example on the right, according to a research study at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters are in a word. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be there in the right place. So I just put this in because I think what's important to note is that our brains are always predicting what they think is going to come in the text. And oftentimes our dyslexic learners, they're pretty good at that because they just, again, they've kind of got this high ability when it comes to their verbal reasoning skills. But what lets them down is this difficulty that they may have just really identifying these units of sound or even small words in text. But the point about this is that it's really important for us to still engage them, asking them questions that really kind of elicits the meaning of the text. What sits behind these letters? Tell me a little bit about, where do you think this story takes place? Tell me a little bit about this character. Where did they live? How did they live? What do you think the challenges are for this character? Tell me about, do you know anybody who is similar to this particular person in this book? What part of the story tells me this? You want to use as many opportunities to talk about the text that you're reading. Again, in a kind of playful, curious, interested way, because the one thing that's really tough for our dyslexic learners is that it takes 100% more effort to read a piece of text than a child who doesn't have dyslexia. So it can be a very, very tiring process. So what I'm always advocating to families is you don't want to turn this into a formal, official, instructional type activity. You want to do it when you're most comfortable with your child, whether it's going to bed at night, reading a story, or maybe the child's in the car and they've got a little book and you're reading, you're engaging with questions. You want to try to keep it light because they get a pretty tough time at school, particularly those children who've had a lot of difficulties with the reading and writing process. Okay, next slide. Okay, so another really useful tip when it comes to supporting dyslexic learners is to choose the appropriate level book. And this is a little strategy that we've kind of used for a very long time. It's called the 5-finger test. And if your child is showing an interest and motivated to choose a book, so for example, I've got a book here. So let's imagine that they're motivated to choose a book. And you think, oh, I'm not quite sure that book can be read independently. Again, you want to sort of be a bit playful about this. You might say, you know what, let's just have a look at one page. And let's turn to a page, preferably a page without pictures, because that's where you're going to get the best kind of modeled. So I've got a book here in front of me, and Winnie's Great War, and I've turned to a page that does not have any pictures on it. It's just a piece of text. And I would ask my child to read the book out loud or read the page out loud to me. And as we're doing that, again, you could do this yourself or you could do it as togetherness. I would hold up the fingers for every word that they either didn't know or one that they may have stumbled on or haven't read accurately. If you find that you have held up more than 5 fingers, that sort of means that this text needs to be read really with an adult. It's not a book that could be read independently by your child, because the trouble is that the accuracy rate will probably be less than about 95%, somewhere between 90 and 95%, which does have an impact on the ability to get meaning from the text. It might change the meaning of the text, so make it much harder to connect to the actual story that's being told. So anywhere between sort of 0 and 5 fingers, your child should be able to sort of read this book independently. If it's kind of 5 fingers or more, that probably needs your support. It means you want to do some shared reading together. If it's more than sort of 10 mistakes on that page, then that book is just too hard for right now. And we really emphasize that language. You know what? This isn't the book that we're going to read just yet. We probably need to do a little bit more work on our reading and our reading skills to be able to read it in the future. But you're always giving them that hope that yes, things will improve. We're just not ready for this book yet. So the 5-finger test is a really great opportunity. The other strategy that can be used at home is what we call, it's called paired reading. And paired reading is where the parent and the child sit side by side. And there's a little video here, and I won't play it right now because we're so short of time, but what I'll do is perhaps send it to Leo and maybe, actually the link is there and you can have the PowerPoint afterwards, I think. Leo, we've got the video of this, right? I think Leo's got the video, so we can make sure that we get that.
We can also share, if anybody wants to email us at the end, we can share the link.
Yes, and we can share the PowerPoint as well. So anyway, this is a great little video, and it's a good example of paired reading. So paired reading is where you and your child are reading together simultaneously. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to read at a speed that is more or less normal for you, not speeding ahead. And even if you find that your child is slightly behind, lagging behind, that's okay. That's part of the process. So it might be that you say to your child, you know what, let's just do a little bit of practice together. Let's do some paired reading. And you both begin to start. And if your child understands what paired reading sounds like, they should be okay with knowing that they're just going to be a little bit behind the parent. But this is another good strategy that works to help to improve fluency and accuracy. And shared reading is really just the opportunity to take it in turn. So again, we have to remember how effortful the reading process is for our dyslexic learners. So it might be something that I'm going to read a page, you're going to read a page. I'll read 3/4 of this page, you read 1/4 of the page. Again, keeping it light, keeping it playful, so that your child just can engage in the reading process and improve their fluency and accuracy over time. Okay, next slide. Okay, so spelling, the spelling process is almost like an opposite to the reading process. So the reading process, we talk about decoding words. That means taking the sounds and looking at the sounds and then putting them together to make words. Spelling is the opposite. It's encoding. It's actually thinking about the word and then thinking about the individual units of sound that make up that word. So the most important thing really about supporting your child in spelling is to be able to think about it from a multi-sensory process. So that means that you might use color. So the brain loves to work with colors because colors are novel, for example. They make things stand out. They make things more interesting. So for example, if you have been given a list of spellings and your child has to remember those spellings, the first thing you might do, let's take the example of ring, sing, thing, and swing, you might color code the ing, the ing. Okay, those are two sounds, it, and just color code those so that the child is being able to see those really clearly throughout their whole spelling list so they can make some associations in their brain. You might do things that are multisensory, such as writing it in the air, on the carpet, pinching the letters onto your fingers. So, b, e, a, writing the letters themselves, b, b, e, c. You might begin to use letter sounds at this point rather than, letter names at this point rather than sounds as they become a little bit more mature and in sort of upper primary school. So ring would be R, I, and N and G go together because they are one phoneme. So trying to color code, making it multisensory, you might be doing it in sand, you might be baking at the time, and so you might make some letters or make your fingers, make the word in flour, for example. That's the sort of multisensory approach. Looking for chunks in words. So that's when we think about, for example, syllables. So you might actually spell the word out in separate chunks, in separate syllables, so that the brain has an opportunity to just cling to those separate chunks of words. Mnemonics is a really kind of common way for children to be able to remember difficult or irregular words. So the word, for example, because, they remember that because is big elephants can always understand small elephants. So they begin to recognize that those are the letter sequences that make up. And they've done that through a mnemonic, through an auditory little jingle. And the other strategy that is used particularly in schools today and in the UK is morphology, and etymology. So it's like, where do these words come from? How do we build words in the English language? We know that there are Greek prefixes, there are Latin prefixes and suffixes. We're going to learn about the actual roots of these words, and then we're going to put them together to make the word that we are aiming to do. So that's quite a common way particularly for dyslexic learners in Key Stage 2 and 3 onward, to be able to use as a strategy. Okay, next slide. Okay, when it comes to writing, the first thing that's really most important to realize is just how complex the writing process is for dyslexic learners. The writing process is complex for all learners, but particularly for our dyslexic learners. And if we were to look at this pyramid over here, this is a really lovely example of what's actually happening as the brain tries to focus on all of these different aspects to written expression. So not only does the child need to think about their ideas, but they have to think about their phonic sounds. They've got to think about their spelling. They've got to think about the mechanics of actual writing. How do I form that letter again? They've got to think about the vocabulary that they need to be able to express themselves in a particular genre. They need to think about the genre and how that whole text is structured. There's so many different layers that is involved in writing in a writing task that it's really important to be able to support our learners at each one of those stages. Because what tends to happen for our dyslexic learners, they may have fantastic ideas because we know that for some learners, there's a real creativity to our learners. They may have some fantastic ideas, but they cannot put those ideas onto paper because they're just worried about actually their actual mechanics of writing, the technicalities of writing. They're worried about the spellings. So something always gives when it comes to written expression for our dyslexic learners. So we want to provide them with scaffolds. We want to provide them with strategies that they can use to help to reduce the demands of that writing task. So the one thing that always drove me a little bit potty in schools is when, a teacher just might give a title to a child and say, write a story about trees, or, write a story about the adventures of this pirate. And that is just so difficult for a dyslexic learner. It's just the process itself is just too much. So we need to break that process up into much more manageable chunks. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so when it comes to supporting writing, one of the most strategic and best things you could possibly do is you just make everything explicit and you provide models for the child. So if, for example, we're thinking about a particular genre, each major genre that your child will come across, it's got certain language features that becomes almost formulaic. It's really important to be able to find out and identify what is that formula, what are these text features and sentence features and word features that appear in this particular genre, like history or explanations. And then almost like create, okay, if you know that you have to write an explanation, we know that these text features have to be in it. Trying to make it as formulaic as possible for your learners, because our dyslexic learners, they tend to have brains that recognize patterns, and they do that quite well. So if we can almost provide this, there is a pattern to how we write different genres. There is a formula to how we do it. That can help with that whole written expression for your children. So one example would be looking at explanations. We know that explanations involves cause and effect language. So let's just we've got an example here of a word map of all of the cause and effect language that you're likely to be putting into your piece of text. Keep that word map out for your child as they're writing. That's helping to reduce some of the cognitive demands and the cognitive load that is put on them by having to do a whole writing task. Modeling is really important. Most authors have somewhere down the line, they've magpied and they've taken models from other authors or other pieces of work, and they've built on that. That's just the way that it happens. So it's really important for us to provide as many models as we can for our children and say, yes, use them. Let's just change the words around. They need to be able to have these models to build their own ideas, and also to just have that confidence that they can become writers too. When it comes to the actual mechanics of writing, if you've got if you've got a child who's struggling with the actual technicalities and mechanics, one thing I always do is I go back to pattern making. And you can see here on the left part of the screen, each one of our letters more or less follows the same pattern in what we call letter families. So we actually teach those patterns, and then we teach those letters that sort of belong to that pattern. This is another great way for our dyslexic learners to be able to make those connections and also help with the muscle movement that enables them to be more fluent writers. Okay, next slide. Right, so we've just done a real whistle-stop tour through the awareness in terms of what is dyslexia, what are some of the strategies that can support our dyslexic learners. We've talked about some of our adaptations. Those adaptations are the word maps, the scaffolding, the modeling, everything that we can put in place to help our learners to access reading, writing, and spelling with much more ease. And now we're just going to talk a little bit about advocacy. So if we go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, no, I've made a mistake. We're still on to adaptations. One adaptation that you can make is thinking about the font size and the style of writing. There is now such a thing called a dyslexic font. So if you have a dyslexic learner and they're perhaps working on a laptop, or you're asking the teacher to provide them with any workshops, they might consider the dyslexic font. And there's some information online, which is the third box down here so that you can find it. But they've just through research have found that this is an accessible font for our dyslexic learners. Okay, next slide. And of course, more adaptations is assistive technology. Now, I think that schools are not quite yet in a place where they can provide assistive technology to the extent that we hope that they can. So there are many programs such as this one down here called Text Help that provides text-to-speech or speech-to-text software. That's brilliant for our dyslexic learners. These reading pens are fantastic. They're quite expensive. But they're another tool that perhaps a school would consider. And actually, I think AI is going to be playing a big role in this. There's something called bionic reading, which is the center picture here with the font, which is actually by, I suppose, downloading this bionic reader, it means that it's highlighting these sort of key parts of the word that the brain tends to pick up. And they've done some studies on this. So there's quite a lot of assistive technology. In this country, our exam boards, particularly what's called AQA exam board, by 2030, they're hoping to have some of our major subjects with online digital exams. So we are definitely headed in that direction, which is great news for our dyslexic students. Next slide. Okay, so here's the advocacy, and I'm going to hand over to Joanna.
Okay, so thank you, Lisa. Hopefully that was helpful, and there were some specific actions that you can actually take with your young people that you have at home to help them with this really important skill. I just wanted to share a little bit about how to approach dealing with a dyslexic learner if you're looking for a school place in the UK. One of the first things that we would always say is it's really important to share any kind of educational psychologist report. Sometimes the schools call it an ERP. And for that report to be up to date, because obviously learners' needs change over time, and the school, quite often we see families and they say, oh yes, I had my child assessed, but maybe it was at the beginning of year 1 and the child is coming up to year 4 or year 5 and they're starting to prepare them for entrance exams into secondary schools, which does actually happen. You know, people start to prepare their children in year 4 and year 5 for those entrance tests. So first important thing is do share with the schools if you do have an educational report, and also make sure it's up to date. The second thing that I would suggest you do is before you pay any admissions fees, registering or applying, is to arrange a discovery call with the school. This will be a great opportunity to really find out what the school has in terms of learning support, and whether they will really be able to support, whether they're a dyslexic specialist school, whether they have provisions in place. And also this is a great opportunity for you to talk about your child, maybe to share the school report or to discuss the ERP with the school. And you can do this before paying any fees, because if the school really is not set up to support dyslexic learners, then maybe it's not the place where your child's going to make the most progress. The next thing I would say is that the schools will require all children, even if they are dyslexic learners, excuse me, to sit online assessment tests such as the CAT4 test, which looks at quantitative, verbal, non-verbal, spatial reasoning. They don't normally allow additional time for dyslexic learners, and normally there is quite a bit of a buffer in the CAT4 test for the verbal area of the test. So your child probably won't need more time. But one thing that the schools do say is that they have lower score boundaries for students the younger they are. So, for example, if your child is applying for a year 7 place, then the Cat 4 boundary would be around about, it would need to be above 80. If you wait until year 9, then obviously the boundary goes up. And again, for year 10, so the boundary would be around 105. And the reason for that is
just
that,
to add to that. Oh, sorry, hon. Sorry. To add to that, those are standardized scores. So standardized score of 80, standardized score of 90, standardized score of 105, and that's the lower end, isn't it, of their standardized score?
Exactly. So this is the real, they wouldn't consider children who don't reach those scores, but the reason that they are willing to accept younger children who maybe have a lower score is because if they are a school that has provision in place to support dyslexic learners, then it gives them more time to work with those children and, to help them improve their verbal scores by the age groups that they're getting to the exam years, which is obviously year 9 is the first year before exams. And then in the UK, most schools do exam courses starting from year 10. So our advice would be that it would be easier for a child to get access to a school place at an earlier age, but that the best thing is to be very honest and upfront with the school if you do have an educational psychologist report, and just to make sure you have the most up-to-date one when you're contacting the school. And then one thing that a lot of UK schools are doing now, which is a great program for students who maybe struggle with language, or maybe who actually English is not their first language and they really want to focus on improving their English. A lot of the larger boarding schools are offering now just a 1-year pre-A-level program where the entry requirements are quite different from the general entry requirements. It's really suited for those who want an extra year to get used to the UK system, or maybe their English level is not high enough to really access the curriculum full-time, so they need maybe a year of preparation. So they will take children whose English is not at the level that they would take them straight into year 12, sorry. Or for students who want to improve their English and they want to have a year overseas and then come back and take their local final off to university exams. So that is also something that a lot of the UK schools are now offering, and is a great option to consider later down the line. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of information about, what you can do at home, and then maybe what to start thinking about when you're looking, or if you are looking for a school place for the UK. And we have a couple of resources which we would be very happy to share with you. We have a screener, which is a free screener that you can do, that your child can do at home, and then it comes to us and we can send you a very brief overview of the results along with some insights. That's something called the SDQ screener. And then we also have a reading journal, which is full of more tips about helping children on that journey to learning to read, and particularly focused on things which would be great for children with learning differences. So if you would like to receive either of those free resources, please do feel free to reach out to us either through Leo. He would definitely be able to put you in contact with us. Otherwise, I'm just sharing on the screen at the moment our email address. So info@bbe.team. You can also visit our website. The the free screener and the reading journal, they're not on the website yet. So please do email us directly if you would be interested in receiving those. So I'm just going to try and stop sharing the screen now.
Usually we will have quite a couple of questions in the chat box, but right now we only got one or two technically. Do we need to provide specialist dyslexia assessment diagnosis report for school admission purpose as a proof?
For the UK admissions, the school would expect to receive a report from families. However, I think, Joanna, I mean, even if the families were to come without a report, but to say there are some learning differences here, I think it's about being transparent, isn't it, upon admissions?
Yeah, absolutely. And what the school admissions people normally say to us is that they would really like an educational report, and the most up-to-date one possible. And the other thing that they also ask for is a reference from your school. So if you have, the best thing is to have a good relationship with your current school, and then ask them to write a reference for your child, and that will be reviewed by the school that you're looking at. And it'll be really helpful when they're looking to see if the child would thrive in their school.
Yeah, and I think also just to add to that, that we are working with a family, Joanna, aren't we? That if you had a report in Hong Kong, for example, and you knew that you would need to access services in the UK, it's good to come with that report, that even if it's a report that's been done in Hong Kong, for example. Isn't that right, Joanna?
Yes. So for example, if you have an EdPsych report done in Hong Kong, and you want to access, for example, the UK support services, so something called CAMS, which is the service that children who have learning differences go through in the UK, you can skip quite a few steps in that process if you have an EdPsych report, and you also have some accommodations in process. So whether for ADHD, for example, you might have some form of medication, even if your child hasn't taken it for very long, but even if it's just prescribed in Hong Kong, then quite often the services here in the UK will help you to continue on that path. There is obviously a waiting list, and delays do happen. So in the interim period, sometimes you need to go through a private service, but having that report from Hong Kong is extremely valuable. And having any kind of interventions, whether it's medicine, or it could be tutoring, or it could be specialist interventions with a coach or a mentor. It's great if that's already started in Hong Kong, and then there is a chance that you would be allowed to continue that here in the UK.
Thank you. Since we haven't got any other, we still got two more. The second question is actually a follow-up of the first question. Would it be better to do the specialist assessment in the UK than in Hong Kong if we are applying for a school in the UK?
I think what our experience is that you can definitely use assessments from Hong Kong. We do offer an assessment service at Beyond Bridges, and what we find is sometimes families get an assessment from an EdPsych, and it doesn't have very much detail around how to support the child, or anything very much beyond outlining the difficulties that the child might have. So Lisa, maybe you want to explain a little bit more about the different types of reports there are.
Yeah, so I think just sort of in response to that question, something that Joanna and I are talking about, or what we found, is that the reports that are sometimes received from clinical psychologists tend to be very clinical. What we do is we really do a strengths-based report. So it means that if you're upon, trying to go through admissions to the school of choice, if the first page, for example, is quite, language that could be quite sort of negative because it's quite clinical, sometimes that can be a deterrent for the person reading and receiving that report because they think perhaps the difficulties are much greater than they are, but it's because it's sort of got a clinical interpretation. So what we find is actually what there's a couple of situations we're in recently is a family have come with a set of reports and we've done a review assessment because we're saying, well, look, let's actually find the strengths of this child so that we can report on those strengths as well as talk about some of the challenges they may face. And that sometimes helps, particularly in private or independent education admissions processes.
Are there any schools in the UK which provide specialized programs for dyslexic students?
Yes, there are. They tend to be fee-paying schools, so private education. But yes, there are schools. There's a whole group of schools that focus particularly on differences, but these are independent schools.
Thank you. And I believe the last question will be, thank you for this free screener. Can it be administered by parents?
Yes, it can. It's just simply, you can either print this free screener and have your child respond to it, and then you can scan it to us. Or there's also an online link which can do that for you. If you were to do it through the online link, this is a screener that is not, we did not construct this, we use this, but it belongs to another publishing house. But if you did it yourselves, we would be very happy to help interpret it. And there's no cost to that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today, Joanna and Lisa. It's our third time already, and we look forward to the fourth time we should talk about different topics.
That's great. Well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Any parents, if you've got any other questions, feel free to get in touch directly with me, and then I'll just form a group with Lisa or Joanna, and then we can talk about your child in a different scenario.
That's
wonderful.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay,
See you next time.
bye-bye.